Hey everyone, this is Krista Bontrager. I want to thank you for watching today. And this is part of a continuing series that I am doing related to race issues. And recently I was reading through the 70-page document by the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, and this is the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention. And the document details the racist beliefs and practices of its key founders. In fact, it's called, here on the screen, you can see this, Report on Slavery and Racism in the History of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. It's really quite an interesting and, I will say, very sad document that I do highly encourage you to read. Now, toward the beginning of the document, it says this: all four of the men whom Southern Baptist leaders elected as the seminary's founding faculty held slaves. The slave schedule of the 1860 federal census for the Greenville district recorded that John A. Brodus held 2 slaves, William Williams held 5, Basil Manley Jr. held 7, and James P. Boyce held 23. When Southern Baptists established the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in 1859, the prevailing orthodoxy of its white clergy included the commitment to the legitimacy of slavery. As I worked my way through the report, I could see that the founders of SBTS didn't merely passively allow for the existence of slavery and saying that that's maybe a states' rights issue. Rather, they vigorously advocated for its morality based on a belief that the subjugation of blacks was part of God's created order. And here's a quote to that effect from another one of the school's founders. Basil Manley further suggested that since God appointed them to a state of perpetual slavery, they had no natural right to freedom. And he's speaking of black people. Quote, all will depend on this question: is liberty of person given to all? God gives power to some and bondage to others. Only God can be held accountable for the differences in social condition and inequalities of human capacity. To quarrel with this will be to waste our rage upon a dispensation as old as nature. Slavery was a natural constitutive element of all human society. Now, I also noticed as I was reading the document that this belief that it was the God-ordained order for blacks to be subjugated mostly rested on the rather peculiar incident with Noah and his sons in Genesis chapter 9. Now let's take a minute just to read 2 or 3 critical verses here, starting in verse 25. Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will be to his brothers." He also said, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Shem. May Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend Japheth's territory. May Japheth live in the tents of Shem. And may Canaan be the slave of Japheth." Now, the wording of Noah's curse on his grandson Canaan, in other words, to be the lowest of the slaves to his brothers, this statement was repeatedly used by the founders of SBTS to argue that it was the destiny of Canaan and his descendants to serve as the slaves of Noah's other sons, and that black slavery was the outcome of this. This was kind of the biblical warrant for black slavery. Now let's look at a couple of additional quotes from the seminary's founders to show proper documentation for this point. Manley argued that God established slavery as the permanent condition of Africans after the flood. Noah's prophecy condemning Canaan to perpetual slavery was observedly fulfilled by the African race. Quote, whatever interpretation you choose to give, look at the facts. That man's race in all times, in all countries, not excepting his own, has been in a state of servitude. In Africa, 3/4 are slaves. Efforts have been made at different points to civilize them, unquote, but without success. Quote, from age to age they have fulfilled this saying of Noah, if it be not meant of them of what people is it meant. The report continues a few pages later. It says this: God has established that slavery was, quote unquote, essential to the existence of civil society, and that God had appointed Africans to serve as slaves forever. Quote, from Ham were descended the nations that occupy the land of Canaan, and those that now constitute the African or Negro race. Their inheritance, according to prophecy, has been and will continue to be slavery. Genesis 9 was repeatedly used as a spiritual cloak of this time period to couple God's holy name with unholy acts of dehumanizing behavior against people who bear his image. Now, personally speaking, I was vaguely familiar that the LDS Church used the mention of God putting a mark on Cain in Genesis 4 as referring to dark skin, and that this interpretation of Genesis 4 actually prevented blacks from being holding in the priesthood in the LDS Church until that policy was changed in the late 1970s. And you can see the official LDS statement on their website here. But honestly, I was not aware that these verses in Genesis 9 were used by Bible-believing Protestants in a similar fashion as the LDS Church until I read this SBTS report a few weeks ago. Now, the next day after reading this report, I was discussing the issue with a close friend of mine, and she pointed out a passage in an old book by Louis T. Talbot that contains several statements on his views on race. Now, Talbot is the namesake of the seminary where I attended, so I was very curious to read these words for myself. Now, in his classic book, Bible Questions Explained, which was published first in 1938, but you can still get a copy of it right now on Amazon, and it doesn't seem to be redacted, Talbot devotes several pages to explaining his theories about the curse against Ham, particularly his son Canaan, and its connection to the black race. Now, as part of Talbot's answer to questions about the curse of Canaan, he quotes a lengthy passage from another book, the Pulpit Commentary, as part of his answer. And he says this: the Hamite races, originally the most brilliant and enlightened, Egypt, Babylon, and Canaan, had the greatest tendency to degenerate because they were the most disinclined to true religion, the great preserver of men. So apparently, Talbot believed that these darker-skinned descendants of Ham had a tendency to degenerate because they rejected religion. Now, this strikes me as a 21st century Christian as a fairly peculiar view. But okay, let's continue and see what else he has to say. He goes on to quote the critical and explanatory commentary as well. It says this, quote, the doom has been fulfilled in the destruction of the Canaanites, in the degradation of Egypt, and the slavery of Africans, the descendants of Ham. So based on these statements, I'd say that Talbot believed that the enslavement of Africans was some kind of fulfillment of Noah's statements in Genesis 9. Now, I turn the page a couple of pages later, and Talbot continues to clarify his position about the connection between Canaan and the origin of the black race. Why are Egyptians not as black as the Negroes? Both are descendants of Ham. What are the Abyssinians? Also children of Ham, not Negroes? They live in the same latitude as do the blackest people. I think the answer lies in the fact that the Negroes came from Canaan, who was under a curse, whereas the Egyptians and the Abyssinians were descended from other sons of Ham. Now again, Dr. Talbot affirms a belief that black skin is the result of Noah's curse on his grandson Canaan. It is irrefutable, he says, that God has stamped the Negroes with characteristics which forever distinguish them from other races, characteristics of which color is only one, And it is not by chance that the Negroes has been a servant of servants. This fact is but prophecy fulfilled. Now, based on these statements, I'd say that Talbot believed that dark-skinned people were the descendants of Canaan and that slavery experienced by blacks was the fulfillment of Noah's prophetic statements. Now, I have to tell you that coming to terms with the reality that giants of the faith advocated for such ideas raises several provocative questions for me personally. I mean, how could such an educated and informed Christian leader simultaneously hold such right and wrong beliefs? How could the founders of SBTS serve as defenders of truth on the one hand, while at the same time own human beings as slaves? How could a man like Louis T. Talbot, who was instrumental in my own grandparents coming to faith in the gospel through his teaching on the Biola Hour, have made such a flimsy biblical argument against an entire race of people? These are very hard questions that I am still thinking through, and I will be making a separate video wrestling through this question of what to do with these historical figures who held beliefs of racial inferiority and superiority. But we're going to set that question aside just now. With this historical framework in place, I will take a closer look at the biblical foundation for the curse against Canaan and his descendants in part 2 of this teaching. Thank you for watching.